Andrew Yang, who is a Democratic presidential candidate going for the 2020 nomination. Right now, he's polling, I think, around like 1 or 2%, but he's actually been growing fairly quickly. He was on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast not all that long ago. Right now has, I believe, 116,000 followers on Twitter. And he recently was the first presidential candidate that I can think of who decided to bring up the issue of the LA Act in MMA. This was something that had come up a lot more in 2016. Um, Not from a presidential standpoint, but just like as a news story. But it's kind of faded away a little bit. But his tweet says MMA fighters in the UFC receive only 10 to 50% of revenues versus about 50% in other sports. I would apply the Ali Act to MMA and allow fighters to unionize. Firing Leslie Smith when her opponent didn't make weight was clearly retaliatory. Dana White should stop boasting about revenue. So there's a lot to get into on this tweet in and of itself. First, what I'll do is I'll just go to the Ali Act and talk about what that even means in the first place. And then from there, I'll get back to the tweet. So the Ali Act was initially put in place for boxing. It was put in place. It was introduced in 1999 and enacted in 2000. And in this article here, it talks about some of the reasons why Congress felt it was necessary to do it. So I'll read what those reasons are and talk about whether or not I think those apply to MMA. So the first one is professional boxing is not governed by any league, association, or any form of an established organization like the majority of other professional sports. As far as MMA goes, I think you could say the UFC does do that. There's also the commissions in charge. A lot of the state commissions have a large say in how it's governed. So whether or not that's an issue that really applies to MMA, where they would need to have the LA Act applied, I don't really think that's the case. For number two, the state officials are not ensuring the protection of boxers and are not aware or informed of contracts boxers have agreed to. To my knowledge, the state officials are fairly well aware of the contracts that the MMA fighters have agreed to. We know about the disclosed pay. It seems like they're kind of well aware of how all this works out. So again, I don't know if this is an issue that really applies to modern day MMA. Number three, promoters are taking advantage of the sport by conducting dishonest business affairs. Promoters are not being punished due to some states being less strict about the legal terms that are stated in contracts. As far as that goes, I don't really know that it applies in any way other than possibly in drug testing, where you'll see Bellator will do all these events on Indian reservations, and it kind of seems like some of the guys who fight on those events may be guys who probably would be popping for steroids if there was more stringent testing. I don't know what the testing is in those specific cases, but it seems like you could maybe argue that's an issue, but that's more of a steroid testing issue than it is a financial thing. And to me, again, this doesn't seem like that major of an issue where you feel like you have to apply this act MMA. Number four, there is no rating system provided to rank professional boxers, and thus ratings are subjected to manipulation by those in charge. There are individual outlets who do rate MMA fighters across promotions, but as far as promotion by promotion goes, the UFC does have their own ranking system that's done by independent journalists. I think the UFC may have a say in who is eligible to be ranked, but I don't know if they have a say in who actually gets ranked and where they get ranked. A big example of this would be that they have a title fight coming up, or an interim title fight coming up between Israel Adesanya and not Robert Whitaker, and Kelvin Gastelum. And in the rankings, this is a 4 versus 5 matchup. And typically, if you're thinking about like a tournament standpoint, 4 versus 5 is a quarterfinal matchup, not a final matchup. And if the UFC had a say in it, you'd figure they would probably push those two guys up a little bit higher, so the matchup actually seemed like it belonged just based on a ranking standpoint. But instead, they're just going with the rankings that they have. So to me, it seems like there's some independence there, even if they do have a say in who gets ranked. Sometimes you'll see, like I think the Diaz brothers have kind of been taken in and out at questionable times. For number five, there has been a major influence in the sport because of open competition by restrictive and anti-competitive bodies. I mean, to an extent, you could maybe say that's the case, where you have fights like a Michael Chandler versus Khabib Nurmagomedov fight that can't happen because the UFC doesn't want to co-promote with Bellator, and Bellator doesn't seem to want to co-promote with the UFC, or at least not on the terms that the UFC would probably require. So maybe you could argue there's a case there. I don't know if there's a whole lot of major fights that are being held off in MMA because of this. For the most part, a lot of the fights that we want to see do end up happening, and a lot of them end up happening under the UFC banner, but they do end up happening fairly often. It seems like more of a rarity than a common occurrence when the big fights don't happen. And then number six, there are no restrictions placed on contracts that boxers agree to with the promoters and managers. It is necessary to enforce the national contract reform, which will guarantee the safety of professional boxers and the public from unlawful contracts and to enhance integrity of the sport. Again, I don't really know that that's a major issue in the UFC right now. The contracts do seem pretty fair. The UFC does a decent job of at least offering the fights. There are fighters who may not like the fights that are offered, and so they'll stay out, or maybe they sign a contract that is for X number of fights, but then halfway through they feel like they're worth more and they want to renegotiate, and the UFC wants to work off of the contract that's already in place, which I guess is kind of interesting because I guess on one hand, if you're a fighter on a 5-fight contract and you lose early on and the UFC wants to break it and cut you early, they can do that. But if you're like 2 fights in and you want to leave, you're still under contract, so you really don't have that freedom. But on the other hand, if you're on a high-paying contract, the UFC isn't going to renegotiate for less for the most part. But you're often going to see fighters try to renegotiate for more, which is a little bit interesting. But with that being said, do I think that the All Act needs to be applied to MMA? Not exactly based off of that, but let's go back to the tweet. So as far as the MMA fighters receive 10 to 15% of revenues versus 50% in other sports, it's worth noting that the other sports are team sports, not individual sports. The reason why that's relevant is because the business model is fairly, it's quite a bit different. Whereas the team sports, they have all their dates set and they kind of know what kind of money they're going to make. They have their TV deals in place. They can pretty safely project what their ticket revenue is going to be. That's not exactly the case in the UFC. Also, these leagues, the individual teams oftentimes will lose money. This is especially the case in basketball or in hockey, where there are some teams that just come out in the red year after year. But the league itself will move forward. Whereas in the UFC is the entire league, so they need to come out in the black. He's talking about the Ali MMA Act, which I just talked about. Leslie Smith wasn't actually fired. It was the last fight on her contract. Her opponent didn't make weight, and instead of, I believe Leslie didn't want to fight, or the opponent wasn't willing to fight. So at that point, the UFC just gave Leslie not just the show bonus, which is what they were required to do, but they also gave her the win bonus, which is a little bit extra. But then decided they didn't want to pay her beyond that. Now she was making, I believe, around like $70,000+ in that specific fight, or they ended up giving her that much money. So for the UFC, they may have just said, "Hey, look, she's not worth this kind of money. She doesn't draw enough to justify this kind of money. So we'd either have to offer her less or just not keep her around." And so they chose not to keep her around. It's possible that the issue at hand was that they didn't like what she was doing in Project Spearhead, but even still, this wasn't a firing. So to call it that isn't really fair. And then for him to say that Dana White should stop boasting about revenue, that's kind of bizarre for a guy who has a background as a venture capitalist to be saying. If Dana White wants to boast about revenue because his company is doing well, he should be more than free to do that. But it's also worth mentioning that in this space, in MMA, there have been other promotions who have tried paying fighters a lot more, but the margins really just aren't there to support it. You've seen promotions like Affliction just go under really quickly after trying to pay a bunch of money. Strikeforce had their investors get a little antsy and pull out and force them to sell to the UFC. So if the idea was that MMA promotions could easily pay 50% of their revenues to fighters and still be very profitable, then you would think that another promotion would do that, be able to pull away some of the top talent, and then with that top talent would be able to compete with them and even beat the UFC because they're able to pay the fighters more, so the fighters come over, they have better talent, they put on a better show, and fans flock over there. But it hasn't been the case because obviously there's a lot more to the fight promotion business than that, and that's why most promotions that start end up failing. So John Fitch said that we don't need an association, we need an association, not a union, and then he tagged the MMAFA. His point being that a union would just apply to the UFC, whereas an association would be across all promotions. Andrew Yang said he liked that. My tweet in there is just pretty much recapping what I just said. He also brought up some issues with Ariel Helwani, saying that he wanted Helwani to stand up and make a bigger case for this, but he doesn't think that he's doing it because he's with ESPN, and that Bill Simmons had some issues with the NFL where he was talking bad about the NFL and got fired by ESPN because of it. So because ESPN has a big deal with the UFC, he feels that Ariel Helwani isn't going to be able to say what he thinks about the UFC. It's hard to say. Obviously, Helwani's had a past of saying things that aren't exactly in line with what the UFC likes to hear, and that's why they opt not to put him on the fight broadcast when they're in charge of production. It's also why he had the major issues before where he was getting kicked out of events and had the major fan backlash. So it's not like Ariel Helwani has a past of being friendly with the UFC or anything, but it's possible that maybe now that he's under contract with ESPN, he's going to be a little bit careful. But even still, just because that's the case, it's not as though Helwani has to push for the Ali Act in MMA or he has to push for it. I think as the sport grows, you're going to see fighter revenues grow, and that's what we've been seeing so far. And to me, do I think that the government needs to be involved here? No. We've seen a lot of growth. The government already is fairly involved in MMA. Obviously, this is a regulated sport, but for there to be the extra involvement with the Ali Act, I just don't see the need for it. When you're a fighter, you know what you're getting into. If you look at how boxing has been affected by the Ali Act, sure, if you're like one of the top boxers, maybe the Ali Act's good for you because it gives you a chance to fight against some of the top guys. Like we're seeing this at heavyweight with some of these guys in different promotions who are getting a chance to fight each other. But I just really don't see the need for it in MMA. And though the top guys in boxing have done well with it, a lot of the lower guys in boxing get paid significantly less than what the guys in the UFC make. So it depends on who you're looking at as far as whether you think the Ali Act has been really successful in boxing, whether you think it's been an absolute failure. And if you look at most fighters, it's been a pretty big failure for them. They're not making a whole lot of money.